Welcome to the Google office and our second event of cracking the technical interview.
Welcome. For those of you who may have met me last time I was at the University of Waterloo for DSC, or for anyone who wasn't rather, my name is Nick Deakin. So let's start with talking about what to expect in a technical interview. Every interview, especially ones that you thought went poorly, can be a lesson as well.
Can everyone hear me? Awesome. So we're going to be starting now. And first off, welcome to the Google office and our second event of cracking the technical interview. So again, we have Nick Deakin from Google Stadia, who joining us with teaching us how to crack the technical interview. And yes, this event is live streamed, so there are quite about, I believe, 200 students also viewing this event. And yeah, let's just welcome Nick on stage.
And just for anyone on the live stream, so you know, there's like a 30-second delay between what's happening here and what you're getting. So if it seems like we're ignoring you, I promise that's not the case, at least not intentionally. Hi everyone. Welcome. For those of you who may have met me last time I was at the University of Waterloo for DSC, or for anyone who wasn't rather, my name is Nick Deakin. I work as a software engineer at Google on Stadia. If you did attend that one, this will be pretty similar or exactly the same is what I mean. So sorry, I hope maybe you still learn a little bit. But for anyone who didn't attend the first one, hopefully this will be useful to kind of give you my take on how to do well in technical interviews. I need to give a little disclaimer that these are my own personal thoughts on how to do this. This isn't Google's official stance on how to interview or anything like that. I'll touch on this a little bit later, but Google has a lot of really good resources as well. So who am I? Why am I up here? Why are you listening to me? So I think probably like many of you, or at least in this room, I graduated from the University of Waterloo. Well, attended and graduated. Hopefully you'll all graduate as well. I was in the NanoEng class of 2015. I was fortunate enough to get a lot of really awesome co-op placements that I learned a lot from. These included working as a researcher in a University of Waterloo fuel cell lab, working on manufacturing process improvements at Christie Digital and Kitchener, working in hardware engineering at Kaleidoscape in Waterloo, and finally as a software engineer at Kaleidoscape. I continued to work at Kaleidoscape full-time after graduating. I was fortunate enough to work there for about 3 years after I graduated. I worked mostly on secure media playback on embedded devices. And I started working at Google on Stadia in the summer of 2018, and I've been here since. On Stadia, I work on graphics tools for developers who use the platform. And it's probably worth noting, since this is a talk about interviewing, that I've been an interviewer at both Kaleidoscape and Google. So I've also been on the other side of the table. So what is the purpose of this presentation? I'm hoping to provide a little bit of information on what a technical interview looks like, in particular coding interviews. I'll provide some advice on how you might prepare for these, or at least my advice. Also provide my thoughts on how to actually execute in these interviews. And I'll provide a little bit of my thoughts on the interview process at Google. And generally, I hope all this information will help you feel more confident and able to execute well in your interviews. It's also maybe worth touching on a point like, why do you even care about this? Why do you care about doing well in an interview? So in my opinion, I've been working in tech for about 5 years now as a software engineer. And I've found it's really awesome. And to get that sort of job, you probably have to do some sort of interview like this. If you're hired somewhere without showing them you know how to code, then that might be a little bit of a red flag. But so I think that's a pretty good motivation to want to be able to interview well and maybe to land these sort of jobs if you would find that fulfilling and a fun work environment, which I've definitely enjoyed in my time so far. So let's start with talking about what to expect in a technical interview. So if any of you have interviewed for these sort of positions already, you probably know most of this, but the most common type of technical interview is a coding interview. So the interviewer might ask you a little bit about your resume, but the bulk is probably going to be giving you a programming-related challenge and asking you to solve it, writing something that resembles actual code on paper or a whiteboard. So examples of what these sort of questions might look like is something like reverse a linked list, determine if a particular element is present in a tree, or find the longest palindromic substring in an input string. I think it's also worth mentioning here, though, that it can be a little bit more to this than just a coding interview. Interviewers may ask you about projects on your resume, likely because they want to know that you actually understand what you worked on. And for more senior students or for full-time positions, it might not be unlikely for them to test other aspects of your software engineering abilities. And this could be things like design, testing, or debugging skills. These can be full interviews in of themselves if you're interviewing for a full-time position. So examples of what these might look like would be being asked to design an API for a thing based on some arbitrary requirements, writing a test plan or a test method for a thing, or looking at a broken program and trying to identify what's wrong. These are all actual questions I've been asked in interviews for full-time positions. I think it's also really important to take a moment and think about what the interviewer is trying to get out of the interview. And I think they're generally trying to answer a few specific questions. First, and maybe foremost, do you know how to actually write code? Do you have a good understanding of data structures and algorithms? Can you communicate effectively, in particular on technical stuff? Do you have a good problem-solving strategy? Do you pay attention to details? And definitely most importantly, would you drive me crazy if I actually had to work with you every day? So now that we think we understand what the interview is all about, let's talk about how to prepare for this. So more important than anything else, practice writing code. Give yourself a question, give yourself a time limit, and try to actually do it in the environment you'll be trying to do it in the actual interview. I highly recommend the book, Cracking the Coding Interview. It's got a bunch of practice problems in it. It's got a good kind of table of contents of various data structures and algorithms. I found it was easily worth the time it saved scouring the internet for good practice problems. In addition to practicing writing code, study your data structures and algorithms, especially the ones you're uncomfortable with. I studied harder for my Google interview that got me the job than I studied for any exam in university. I'd also recommend practice writing code on a computer a little bit. If you know what language you're going to be doing the interview in, then you want to feel comfortable and confident in that language. So, right now I write C++ mostly for my job. So, I could write probably good enough C++ code to compile, on paper. And so you want to feel that kind of same confidence going into an interview, ideally. I'd also recommend study subject matter at least a little. So in particular, know what the interviewer's company does. If their job posting doesn't say it, Google it or figure it out somehow. And if the position is specialized in some way, then make sure you're not too rusty on that thing. So, for me, when I interviewed at Google, I knew it was for a graphics-related position, so I studied graphics stuff a bunch because, I anticipated they would probably ask me about that. Here's also a repository I created for studying, and this kind of gives an overview of my idea of what I like to know data structures and algorithms-wise. There's one particularly useful file in there that basically is a list of all the data structures and algorithms I want to feel I have some, familiarity with because someone, I might be asked a question about it. And you can probably guess from, if you were to look at that file, which data structure I feel, less comfortable with relative to most. Half the file is trees. Interviewers love trees. I don't tend to use them in my day-to-day work, so it's something I want to feel, confident with going into an interview that if they ask me a question about trees, I'll at least know enough to have a shot at solving the problem in a decent enough way. So what should you bring and wear to an interview? My checklist includes pens, probably at least 2, one for myself, maybe a backup, maybe one for the interviewer, so maybe you bring 3. Paper, at least a couple sheets, and this would be to write down things like, what is the pay for the job? Maybe questions that you might want to ask later in the interview, or things of that nature. I'll also bring copies of my resume, usually enough for each interviewer and myself. This really shows that you're prepared, and interviewers tend to like it, especially if they realize, oh crap, I forgot the resume. And I think it's really nice to have some sort of business binder type thing, as you see image there. to keep everything organized and kind of look sleek. As far as what to wear, a suit is always a safe choice in my opinion. I'm pretty sure I wore a suit to every single one of my co-op interviews because, you know, that seemed like the safest choice. And I think it's always better to overdress than underdress. You don't want to show up in, you know, jeans and a t-shirt and your interviewer's be in a suit and you're like, oh crap, this isn't going to go well. And even if the interviewer says you can dress casually, I still recommend dressing up a little. You know, you really want to put your best foot forward and show them that you're a professional who's going to be able to get the things done that they want to get done. When I interview now, for what it's worth, I would probably wear a polo or a dress shirt tucked into any pants that aren't jeans. You know, realizing now that it's been a long time since I've had an interview with an interviewer who was wearing a suit, so I'm a little more comfortable not dressing up to that extent now. Oh, last but not least, but perhaps most importantly, turn your phone to silent. Neither you or the interviewer wants your phone to go off in the middle of the interview. And for real, practice. Like, there's nothing else you can do to really get good at this skill. Like most things, practice is the most important part. You know, not reading solutions, not kind of transcribing an algorithm, actually try and solve problems in the environment you're going to be put in to do it on the spot. So now that we've talked about preparing for an interview, let's talk about what are some of the strategies I employ in an interview to try and do well, you know, at that time during execution. So I'm going to talk a lot about the beginning of the interview because I think that's one of the most important parts. And I think that because the decisions you make at this point in the interview will largely guide how you spend the rest of your time and kind of how the interview goes. So my high-level thought process after I've been presented the question goes something along these lines. I'll think to myself, do I actually understand this question? Do I know what they're asking of me? And if I don't, I'll ask questions until I do understand. And a really good strategy to confirm that you understand the problem is to restate it in your own words to the interviewer. And this isn't just applicable for interviews. This is just, you know, an effective communication technique, I find. Next, I'll ask myself, do I understand the inputs, outputs, and any constraints or maybe shortcuts to the problem? So for example, are there edge cases you do or don't need to worry about? Or is your input entirely random? Is it maybe partially sorted? Is it maybe entirely sorted? These sort of things can give you a big edge up to, you know, asking these questions rather can potentially give you a big edge up on solving the problem efficiently. And so next, I'll think to myself, what is the dumb way to solve the problem? You know, the easiest way I can think of, or the first way that comes to my mind, usually some sort of brute force solution. And I'll explain this to the interviewer as well. I'll say, you know, this is what comes to mind first. And then I will try and think of, okay, is there a more clever way to do this? But don't spend a whole lot of time on that because you really want to get something done rather than just nothing because you spent the whole interview trying to think of the perfect way to solve this problem. In general, I try and walk the interviewer through this process, at least the second half. And I find I almost always end up asking at least one question to the interviewer, if not several. And that's not a bad sign. Interviewers, I think a lot of the time will intentionally ask slightly vague questions because they want to see that you're thinking about the problem and asking the questions that you need to know answers to solve it effectively. So now that I think I understand the problem, let's go about creating the solution. I'll start with whichever solution I'm confident I can actually implement, even if this is maybe not a particularly efficient one. I'll make a conscious effort to talk my interviewer through the process the entire time, including why I'm writing the code I'm writing. Remember, they can't read your mind. All they see is what you write, and all they hear is what you tell them. I'll make an effort to pick effective variable names because I don't want to work with someone who's going to name all their variables one-letter names, and then I have to look at that after and be like, what the heck is this? Also, remember, it's okay to refactor as you write if you realize something could be a little better. But kind of by that same token or on the other side of it, you know, it's also okay to add arrows and stuff like that to illustrate, you know, lines that should be somewhere else. You know, even all interviewers have also been on the other side of the table most likely, and they know you can't just like push enter and make that new line to write, you know, to insert the line you forgot. And try and take a moment every now and then to look at the bigger picture and make sure things are fitting together the way you intend, hopefully kind of like you would do coding normally. So before you tell the interviewer you're done, or when you think you're about done, these are kind of some final steps I'd take to try and make sure I've thought of everything. I'll reread my solution and, be a little bit more nitpicky. Look for things like, did I verify my input to an acceptable degree? Did I make sure I'm not off by one on one of my loops? Did I handle some edge case in the middle, or whatever other maybe weird cases might have arisen due to the nature of the problem? I'll then try and walk my interviewer through an example of two, usually starting with easy ones, like what if the input is null or empty, and then working on something like what if a sane person provided the input and it's actually kind of being provided an input as intended, usually starting with a simple case. And then from there, I would determine the time and space complexity of my solution if I hadn't already, and tell the interviewer why that is. And I'll usually try and explain if I think it's good or not, or if I think maybe it could be better if I had more time. And then if there is more time, I would try to improve my solution if possible. So now let's say things aren't exactly going perfectly. How do we avoid this, or how do we help fix it once we get into that situation? First and foremost, I'd say prepare and practice. These are the easiest ways to avoid being in a bad situation. Additionally, kind of on the ahead of time side of things, be honest in your resume. They're going to find out really quickly if you lied about knowing how to program in some language, or if you lied about, being an expert on something that you clearly aren't because they asked you a question about it and you don't even know what the words mean. Also, make sure you're ready to write code in an acceptable language. So if you know what the interviewer expects, definitely be ready to use that, because there's probably not going to be a lot of wiggle room. Especially, they might want you to use that language because that's the language they need you to use on the job. Additionally, if there is wiggle room and the interviewer suggests a language you're not familiar with, I would always recommend asking if an alternative is okay. In a lot of situations, you might be pleasantly surprised. I know as an interviewer myself, I would much rather see you write code in a language you're proficient in than see you try and do something on the fly and not really know what you're doing, because then I'm not really seeing the best of your abilities. Be honest with the interviewer and tell them if you don't understand the problem. This is actually a good thing, I would argue, because it shows you have communication and problem-solving skills, and it's probably going to lead you towards, understanding the problem and writing a better solution than otherwise. Additionally, I would say don't be afraid to spitball ideas when getting started, especially if you're not exactly sure at first how to tackle the problem. That can be a good way to, get your own creative juices flowing and to show the interviewer that you're not just like stuck with no idea of what to do. You're at least, thinking through things and trying to get somewhere. Similar to that, don't get caught up in figuring out the ideal solution. It's always better to write a bad solution than nothing. As an example, I'm pretty sure I wrote some n to the 7 algorithm for one of my Google interviews that got me hired, but sometimes it's just a hard problem. And then last but not least, sometimes it doesn't always go perfectly, and that's okay. I didn't get hired my first time interviewing at Google. Not to speak the number of times I sent them my resume and didn't hear anything back. Every interview, especially ones that you thought went poorly, can be a lesson as well. Okay, now is where I maybe embarrass myself a bunch. I'm cheating a little bit. The first time I did this presentation, I had not done this problem ever before. I did it once maybe 4 months ago. So I'm going to kind of walk through at least the start of a problem and kind of my thought process as I go about tackling it. And I am going to put the microphone down, and hopefully clicking isn't too bad for people on stream or anyone in the room. Oh, yeah, I should go back here for a sec. So the question is from LeetCode. It was one that someone suggested last time before I gave this presentation. So some background, palindrome is a string that reads the same forwards as backwards. The question is, given an input string S, return the longest palindromic substring. So, first thing, if I didn't know what a palindrome is, I would ask the interviewer that. Next thing, I would think, okay, I might ask the interviewer, do I need to handle empty strings? Also, I'm doing this in C++ because that's what I use on a regular basis, at least. And we're doing this with just like C-style strings. which, presumably if the interviewer didn't already make that clear, you might ask, should I be using like STD string? Should I use C-style strings? What do you want? Given we're using C-style strings, you might ask, do I need to verify null input? Which they'll probably say yes. And you might ask, do I need to handle empty strings? Is there a maximum length to my input that I need to think about? Are there any other kind of constraints or special, let's say, kind of special characteristics of the input? So we're going to say, yes, you need to handle, empty and null, and no, there's no specific constraints on the input otherwise. So we'll say, okay, great. With that, I'm pretty sure I understand the problem. And so I'm going to start writing my solution. So I'd say to them, okay, since I need to worry about null and empty input, I'll check for those first. So, if S is null, then, at this point, I'd probably be like, oh yeah, what should I return if it's null or empty or there's no string? And since I'm also the interviewer in this scenario, it's a lot easier than it will be for all of you. But I'm going to say you can just return null. So, okay, great. Thank you, Nicholas. Then we'll say, okay, if it's empty, so we'll say, so the next case I'm thinking of is if it's empty or length 1. Length 1 is really easy because it's always a palindrome because it always reads the same both ways. So if strlang s, maybe I ask, oh, can I use strlang? And hopefully they'll say yes, which they do because they're me. So let's say if the length of my string is less than or equal to 1, I'm going to return the, so I was going to say return the input string here, but then if my length is 0, I'm returning back an empty string. So I might say to my interviewer, does it matter what I return if I return an empty string? And they're going to say no. Awesome. So, and so my point here is like, yeah, I'm making this really easy for myself, but my point is, a lot of it matters less about what you're actually writing for the code and taking the time to like ask questions and ask the right questions. So we've got a question. Yeah. Oh, yeah, the question was, can I zoom in a little more? Thank you. Hopefully that's a little easier to read. That is not helpful. Okay. So if strlang is less than or equal to 1, return s. Okay, great. Now we get to like the actual case where someone provided same input. So now I'd start to think, okay, what's my real strategy for going about this? I guess realistically, I should have started thinking about this a little bit earlier if I followed my own advice. But I'd already thought about it 4 months ago, so I'm all set. So I think the naive way to do this is I will, what's the brute force way to do this? I'm like, well, the palindrome could start anywhere. So to me, that means I'm probably going to need to iterate over every character, either from back to front or front to back. For ease, I'm going to think, okay, I'm probably going to iterate from front to back. And for each character, I can work backwards and see if the last character matches it. And if it doesn't, move one character in and see if that one matches it. If you find none that match, then you definitely don't have a palindrome. If you do find one that matches, then you kind of do an inner loop and repeat the process. So if the first character matches, if you find one for the first character, great. Then kind of move your check in a character each and do that. So I'm going to save the time and likely embarrassment of actually trying to do all that because it would take a while, and I don't think it's as useful to you guys as spending our time in other ways. So let's say I go type up my solution, awesome, return answer, great. And now, okay, we're done. So we're at the end. So I think, okay, thinking back to my checklist, I'm going to walk through my solution and be a little more picky. So I'm going to say, okay, if s is equal to null, okay, got that case, excellent. What if my string is 0? Or sorry, if it's empty, I'm like, well, the interviewer said it's okay for me to return the empty string in that case. So I'm covered by the if strlang is less than or equal to 1. If it's 1, I can return the string back. Maybe I check with the interviewer, oh, do you want a palindrome that's one character? Maybe they'd say that doesn't count or something. And if they did, then you could modify your solution accordingly. I think, okay, I'm good for null, I'm good for empty. Let's walk through an example of, let's say, AA, which is perhaps the simplest non-length one palindrome you could have. And then I would look through my SKDs and A's and verify that it works properly. And then maybe I'll try with a slightly longer one like ABA. And I'd walk through the interviewer through and say, okay, we're going to enter this loop. We're going to enter that one. The values will be this, and try and illustrate to them that, it actually works. And then if they didn't ask me, I'd get to the point where I say, okay, what's the time and space complexity of my solution? For time, it's going to be, I think, n squared, because I need to, in theory, iterate over every character of the string twice. I think that's right. Close enough, sure. And then last but not least, I might think, okay, is that the best that could be done, or like, could I do better? At this point, I can say, oh, we've only got 5 minutes left, so I don't think I've got more time to make it better. I might add, I think there's probably a smarter solution, but as you can see, I didn't get to it this time. And I think that shows that, beyond what you can actually code, you kind of have some intuition for what your goals should be and, for algorithmic complexity in general. Because I'm certain that the naive way to describe it is probably not the best way to do this. I'm sure smarter people have figured out better ways to do it. And that's my really fast example of some of this stuff. So there we go. It's beautiful. So, okay, so back to the presentation where I know what I'm talking about and have things planned. Excellent. So this is kind of my last little section. I'm going to say a few words on interviews at Google and kind of closing words. So interviews at Google, the information so far should be useful for pretty much any coding interview. Here are just a few of my thoughts on Google technical interviews in particular. First and foremost, there's a lot of really good resources provided online by Google and their interview process. I watched a bunch of YouTube videos and stuff like that before interviewing at Google myself. And frankly, these are going to be more useful to you for preparing for an interview at Google in particular than anything I can tell you myself, because there are people who've thought through this stuff a lot more than I have. So definitely go check that stuff out if you really want some really solid resources for preparing for a Google interview. That said, my thoughts on Google's hiring process are that it places a lot of value on the coding interviews, and it places a lot of value on problem-solving approach and communication in interviews. I also think it's highly objective around interview results based on how kind of interview results are handled. And I also truly think it allows for success even if you don't have the perfect solution to a problem. See my n⁻⁷ algorithm I talked about earlier. It's perhaps worth touching on in case any of you are almost graduating or going to be graduating in the next year or two. I think full-time hiring is very similar to intern and co-op in terms of what the goals are and how it works. But it's a little more involved. It would usually be 4 or 5 in-person interviews. And there'd be higher expectations around your performance because they're going to pay you a lot more and they're going to expect you to do better work. So some closing words. I think it's valuable to understand and keep in mind the interviewer's goals, because otherwise you're like trying to shoot on a goalpost with a goal with no goalposts, something like that. Number 2, and most importantly, practice solving coding problems on paper or whiteboard. Practice makes perfect, and if you don't practice, you're probably always going to find interviewing challenging. And last but not least, you don't need to write the perfect solutions, so don't feel that you need to. It's always better to write something than nothing. And with that, thank you for your time. Good luck with your interviews, and hopefully this will be you soon if you follow some of these tips. And I think we've got some time for questions. If there are questions, I'll do my best to take a little bit of a look at the stream here as well. Yeah, for sure. Here, I'm going to cover a couple here as well. Have to be somewhere. Okay, unfortunately, someone had to go. Asking an interviewer for the hint or suggestion, is it a good sign when we're not sure? My personal perspective on this is that I wouldn't necessarily ask the interviewer. What I would personally probably do in this situation is just kind of say, okay, I'm not exactly sure what to do.
and I just try and spitball ideas. And this kind of, it shows that you're thinking and you're trying, but if the interviewer is like, okay, we need to kind of like get somewhere with this, then they might give you a hint. That's probably what I would do if I were that interviewer. That said, it's always better to not need the hint if possible, but having the interview, if the interviewer feels the need to give you a hint, I don't think that means the interview is definitely like totally gone and you're never getting the job. There might be like kind of one like small part to the problem that you didn't quite realize or didn't quite understand that they might clarify for you. And that might get you, get the ball rolling, and then you're on track for, a great rest of the interview potentially. And I don't think there's any more on the stream at the moment. So if there's any in the audience, I'd be happy to take questions. Yes. That's a great question. So how long does a technical interview typically go on for? Is it usually only one question? So I think this depends on the interviewer. In terms of the actual time length of an interview, I think it's usually going to be in the range of 30 minutes to an hour for co-op positions. I think it's kind of a fixed time usually. I don't know. It was a little while since I did the interviewing thing. I don't know if it's changed, at least the co-op interviewing. But I suspect, usually it's in the 45-minute range is most typical. And I think for asking questions, I think it's common for, I think there's kind of two ways that interviewers might do this. One is they might have kind of a relatively challenging question in total, and ideally they'll kind of start with a smaller part of the problem, and then if it goes well, they might say, okay, we've figured out that part. Now, what about if the problem is different in this way, usually some more complex way? And then they'll try and have you update your solution to accommodate whatever that additional challenge is. And this is nice because it means you can kind of see a scale of how candidates do, because you can see if they're able to understand the more challenging concepts and the easier ones. And as the interviewee, hopefully you're able to at least have an enjoyable interview experience, regardless of if you get to the more challenging part. And maybe no one gets to the more challenging part is also a possibility. I remember asking an interview question for the first time when I was an interviewer near when I started, and turns out it was a lot harder than I thought it was. And so, we didn't get to the end, but it was okay because we kind of structured it this way where there's kind of extensions to the problem, and it worked out well. Other interviewers might go a different route and actually have 1, 2, or 3 questions prepared. And in this sort of case, they might be more simple because there's just less time. So they'd probably be more around the lines of something like do some string manipulation, or do a kind of more simple task than something that's maybe more complex with more context and more questions to be asked about it to solve it well. Does that answer your question? Excellent. And yes.
So this is all been about the technical portion of the year. Is there also a focus on the non-technical outside of disability? Is that relevant?
Yeah, so I did try and touch on this a little bit because it's definitely, not entirely absent. I think the fact of the matter is that a lot of places the technical part is going to be among the most important, kind of combined with that would I hate it if I had to work with you every day part. I think different interviewers and different companies have different let's say, strategies for this. I think some are really more focused on the technical side. I've had others that were, there was, I think, on one of my full-time interviews, one interview I had with, I think, someone higher up at the company who was really just like, how are you going to fit in with the people that we have here? Do you plan on staying in the area or with us for a while? Can I talk to you and ask you questions, and can we communicate effectively? And I assume it's those sort of things that they're trying to evaluate me on with that kind of non-technical interview. There's also stuff outside of coding that is still technical that I kind of touched on a little, like testing and debugging and things like that can come up in interviews, and I have personally had interviews on. Does that answer your question? Excellent. So I think there's a couple other questions here on the chat, so I'm going to answer 1 or 2 of those and then go back to the audience. So first, I recognize this name. So from Rishab, what are some of the common data structures which are asked during technical interviews? That's a great question. I should have expected this because Rishab asked me this question the other day and is now prompting me to answer it. So good on you, because I forgot. So this is a great question. You know, what data structure and algorithms should you know? And I told Rishab as much the other day. You know, the unfortunate answer is like you can't know what the interviewer is going to ask you, and this is why, in my opinion, technical interviews are so challenging, is because there's such breadth of things that you could potentially be asked about. And this is why my strategy when I study for interviews is I want to feel like I have a shot regardless of what the question's about. So that means I want to have at least a basic understanding of kind of definitely the common data structures and algorithms. So my strategy was I looked through a couple different data structures and algorithms textbooks. And, you know, I basically pretty much any of the ones that I saw that showed up, I kind of wrote down on the list and kind of, you know, considered, okay, this is worth knowing a little bit about, or at least like knowing, you know, roughly what the idea is of, let's say, like an AVL tree. You know, no, I don't know how to write an AVL tree just off the top of my head. Like, not even when I study for interviews, I couldn't do it. But to at least understand the basic idea and show the interviewer that I had some idea of what they were talking about, I think is a really awesome step in the right direction. And so, yeah, I would say, like, definitely go broad with your general understanding of like what different data structures and algorithms are. And probably spend more time on like the things that are more common, like maybe like sorting algorithms, I think are good to practice with because as one specific example, just because, you know, they do come up quite frequently and it's a pretty like relevant example, and it will teach you a lot of the things that, you know, are good to have an eye on, like, you know, watching for if your loops are like off by 1 and that you've checked for weird conditions and things like that. I also meant to mention, actually, in regards to that list of data structures and algorithms that I linked earlier in the GitLab repository, like even when I studied all of that information, just in case anyone looks at that and you're like, oh my God, this guy's so much smarter than me. Like, how am I ever going to know all this? I don't know all of it either. And even when I studied that stuff a lot, I still didn't know it all. It was kind of my goal was to know as much of it as I could. And that's why that was the list of information that I put together. The last question at the moment on the chat is, what should be the time distribution of a 45-minute interview for a technical question in terms of thinking, writing code, as well as analyzing? I think this depends a lot on the question. And I think the sort of question an interviewer asks will, in a lot of ways, determine this. So if, you know, for the example I gave, like the palindromic substring, I think there are relatively speaking, not so many weird things to consider with the input and output and like edge cases to consider. There are other more complex questions I've been asked that I feel like the interviewer wants more discussion because there's no reasonable way to solve the problem without asking a few questions, for example. And so I think I can't really give a blanket statement of like, this is exactly what it should be. I think roughly I would aim for like ideally, you know, probably for co-op interviews especially, I would probably think you want to ideally be not spending much more than 5 minutes discussing things before you start writing code after they've given you the problem. Again, don't take that as a hard rule though. Like this could depend. If you're asked like a really complex or challenging question, then this might not be true. And some interviewers will ask questions that are more discussion based. Writing code, I would say, so apart from the thinking, you know, the writing code is, I'm going to say, presumably the part you spend most time on. The analyzing at the end, which I would put in the, you know, rereading your solution, walking your interviewer through one, you know, I'd say is maybe 5 to 10 minutes, like a little bit longer than the talking part. And probably you're going to spend most of the time writing code or looking at your code. And like, even before you're like actually done and ready to walk your interviewer through it, you might read through it a little bit yourself to see if it's working as you expect, which, you know, kind of similar to hopefully what you do when you write code anyways. So yeah, I hope that answers Rishabh's question, second question. Are there any more questions in the audience? Yes.
So suppose in a one, like the first solution you come up with is the most efficient, the best solution. You still have to sort of like pretend to go through the course first.
Yeah, so the question was, if you're presented with a problem and you immediately know like what the efficient way to solve it is, should you kind of do this exercise of like doing the brute force and then doing the better one? I would say no. If you know a good way to solve it, do that way. But unfortunately, that's not going to be the case every time. But I would say really like do give it your best shot on your first try. For me, where I choose to draw the line because of kind of what I feel is most likely to give me a good impression with the interviewer, I will try and start with the solution that I'm most confident I can, or that I'm confident I can actually implement. So if I think there might be some that's like, maybe a little bit better in time complexity, but I don't really know how I'd actually do it, I would probably start with brute force. I would mention the idea to them. I'd say, I think maybe you could do it this way, but I'm going to start with brute force because I could definitely do that. And then near the end, maybe you can go back and update it. But if you know the efficient solution off the bat, I would tell the interviewer as much and say, okay, we're going to do it this way. And then I would do it that way.
Will the interviewers don't have much of a thought process for
yeah, so the kind of follow-up question was, my interviewers worry that you don't have good communication or thought process. And, I don't think that's a concern if you explain to them like how you came to the conclusion you did. So, I don't want to try and think of a specific, I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head, but if they ask you a question that's like, do X thing, and you're like, well, like I know from my data structures and algorithms courses that like this is the efficient way to solve this problem. So that's the way I'm going to do it. Then I think they'd be very happy with that. I would definitely be very happy with that if, you were the interviewee and that was what you told me. If it was a little more ambiguous that it was a good solution, and like it would, I'm not saying you need to like provide a formal proof, but at least like explain to them why you think this is a relatively efficient way, or like, what intuition you might have that like leads you to believe that. I really think that, as long as you explain to them what you're thinking, this kind of communication and thought process concerns are probably not going to arise for them. Are there any other questions in the audience? Yes.
For example, like I'm in first year, I don't teach for sex course, I don't know much about it. But they asked us to like,
yeah, so the question was, what if you get asked a question that is just way over your head? For example, maybe you're an earlier student and you get asked a question about some data structure that you just don't even know about. So I have a feeling I was in a similar position at a time on the other side of the table when I asked someone a question. And, at the end of the interview, I realized like, I don't know if they really knew what I wanted them to do. And it was unfortunately kind of a painful experience. I learned a lesson here, which is like, maybe I should be asking more questions myself as the interviewer and make sure I'm kind of putting the question at the interviewee's level. But I think, what maybe they could have done better, or I wish they had done, was like, if they didn't know what the data structure was that the question was about, tell me. Because, if to be honest, it's maybe not a great sign. Like if they're asking you about some complex data structure because you're going to be working on, I don't know, like SQL databases or something fancy, then, maybe the position isn't quite for you, but at least you're going to be honest and have a better interview experience. You say, look, like, I'm going to be honest, I don't know what that is. They might be happy to explain it to you, and then you have a chance at doing the problem. Or maybe they'd say, okay, why don't we start maybe somewhere a little easier, and maybe we can get there. And I think, even if it's not the ideal outcome, it's better than just kind of like scratching your head for 45 minutes while the interviewer's also sitting there like, oh man, what have we done? So yeah, I think also like, study data structures and algorithms is also one of the things that, they're going to come up. And that's why I would argue that's one of the most important things to kind of prepare for, because, you are going to get questions asked about data structures and algorithms, whether directly or indirectly. Yes.
Suppose it's like a more knowledge type interview, and you're required to do some complex knowledge thing about, let's say, SQL databases, and you go on, or you like to ask the interviewer, kind of get that.
Yeah, so the question was, let's say you're asked some knowledge-based question, like kind of following on, I think, maybe to the example I gave, like something fancy about SQL databases, and you just don't remember the thing off the top of your head. What do you do? Can you ask them if you can look it up on Stack Overflow quickly and show them how quickly you could figure it out? I think, I've ran into this situation a couple times, and what my interviewer did and what I would do as well if I were the interviewer is like, if it's something we know you could Google and find or search on Stack Overflow and find, I don't want you to have a bad interview because of that. Like, I've never spent a day actually working when I wasn't allowed to go on Stack Overflow for some weird reason, So, in the scenario where this happened to me, it was actually, what was it? It was the, I can't remember. It was the formula for finding the roots of a quadratic equation. I can't remember the name of it, which is embarrassing, but the one with the square root of stuff over a thing. Anyway, so yeah, I forgot that one. I was like, oh, we need to do that. I don't remember the formula though. And the interviewer was like, oh, it's this. So, they knew I was on the right track, and that's the important thing. So if it's a situation like that where you're like, oh, I know it's this thing, I just don't remember the exact thing, I would definitely go as far, I definitely say as much. And hopefully, in my opinion, it's not, unless it's like, if it's like pure knowledge that you would just like look up, I really don't think those are good questions to ask as an interviewer personally. So like questions like find a loop in a linked list, I think is a bad interview question, because basically it's like, does the person know the trick or not? And that's why I don't think that makes a good interview question. There might be kind of more domain specific knowledge that is a little more general. And that sort of stuff, I think, is when it's not about knowing the solution. It's about showing you kind of know about the thing a little bit. So like, it might be some question about like, I don't know, like Linux, for example. And I just want to show like, yeah, you kind of know the gist of how Linux works, or like maybe you've used it before or something like that. And that's kind of a different category of things where like some discussion and maybe not knowing the exact answer, but having ideas is acceptable. Does that answer your question?
Like, suppose the interviewer asks, create a REST API, and then you forgot, say, the exact syntax of, a GET.
Yeah, so let's say the interviewer asks you to write a REST API and you forget the exact syntax of a GET request. I think in that scenario, like, I would probably tell them, like, look, I don't remember the exact syntax, and I would probably say, would you either give it to me, or could I kind of put in what I think it could be, and like we just work with that, and hopefully they will say yes. Like, I know most of the time when I'm interviewing, like, I don't really care if you know the exact function signature of the standard library functions. Like, just to see that you have a basic understanding of what goes in and what comes out is enough to make me happy as an interviewer, because it's that kind of understanding that's important, in my opinion, rather than knowing just like these things that you could look up. And unfortunately, I don't think any interviewer is reasonably going to say yes to the can I look it up on Stack Overflow, just because, like, yeah, we can all look it up on Stack Overflow. That wasn't the question. So if that is the case, they probably aren't interested in that answer, as I would guess. But other interviewers might feel differently. So it's, I think asking these sort of questions generally don't hurt. Are there? I think there's one on the chat. So this question is, in an interview with multiple questions, would you recommend prioritizing getting all the questions done, or making sure the ones you do get done are done the best you can do them? I would probably ask the interviewer, actually, in this scenario, what their preference is. At the beginning, if I knew that was the scenario, I would probably ask the interviewer, look, if I have to choose between getting all these done or doing one perfectly, what would you prefer? Because different interviewers might have different preferences with, what they would like to see. I also feel like, as an interviewer myself, I don't generally just give multiple questions up front. Some might, and that's okay. But I think it's, best to always ask your interviewer what they want from you, because like, that's really what it's all about. You want to impress your interviewer. You want to show them the skills they want to see. And so asking them questions or making sure you understand what those things are is important. I hope that answers your question. Yes. Yeah, so the question, if I understand correctly, was that a lot of employers will send out online coding challenges, and you're curious if the actual interviewers see that typically. The short answer is like, I have no idea. I've never worked somewhere where, to my knowledge, they use these sort of challenges. I have been on the other end of them. I've completed them before. And I would assume that most of the time the interviewer has seen it. I think it depends a lot on the size of the company. Like if it's a smaller company, I would bet they almost certainly have, because they're like probably the person doing everything. They might have even written the questions you answered on the coding challenge or something along those lines. So yeah, I think it depends a lot. And the short answer is sometimes they might not. Yes.
Heard that most technical interviews are the answers written on a whiteboard. So if that's the case, how much room do you allow for error in that case?
Yes. So the question was, assuming you're writing your solution on a whiteboard, how much room do you leave for error? So that's a good question. I would say I don't intentionally leave blank lines typically, because I wouldn't have enough room to finish the problem if I just left like a blank line every other space. There are scenarios like what I might do that is close to that is like, maybe I know I need to loop over something, but I don't know all of what I'm doing in the loop yet. So I'll kind of put the end of it roughly where I hope it might end up, and maybe you end up needing to move it around later. As I mentioned, I think in the presentation, like interviewers understand that you can't just like make space. So having like arrows that are like, oh yeah, add this line here, or like arrows that are like, oh, switch these two lines because they were in the wrong order, are, in my opinion at least, totally fine. Like I get that it's not easy to like insert that line or make that edit on the whiteboard when time is of the essence. So I'd say part of it is also like practice writing on a whiteboard if possible. Like I actually bought myself a cheap whiteboard from like Walmart or something at one point, because it's like, this is going to be an effective way to practice. And it definitely made me more comfortable with kind of the time limit and just being comfortable writing on a whiteboard, because that's not something I do a lot. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
In terms of like syntax, and if you're making errors actually generating code, like say I miss a semicolon or
Yeah. So yeah, the question was how careful do I have to be with my syntax? If I miss a semicolon, are my chances done? I would say definitely not. At least I think for any reasonable interviewer, like the way I think about it at least is like, look, I don't care if you forget one semicolon. Like I will pay it almost no attention. If you don't add any semicolons in your C++ code, I'm going to start scratching my head and be like, I don't know if we're on the same page here. So that's where I'd say kind of the line is like, understand like, small typos or things like that happen, like forgetting one semicolon. But you need to illustrate you generally understand the syntax as appropriate for your language. And similar for like paradigms, like if you're in some language where there's some, syntactic sugar for like doing a loop over something that is commonly used, ideally you will do that because it shows you understand the language and how to use it in the commonly understood paradigms. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes. Yeah. So the question was, would you ever be asked to write, basically answer a question in pseudocode? Correct? Yeah. So I think in co-op interviews, based on my experiences, that's highly unlikely, because like knowing how to actually write code is like too important to not test at all. Like I would never want to hire someone without seeing them write actual code. I think for full-time positions, it is not as uncommon to get into more pseudocode range, like pseudocode kind of questions. I've definitely been on the interviewee side of some of those questions where I've been asked to kind of do a pseudocode sort of thing, because the company has also given me actual coding questions. But those two can complement each other nicely, because when you're writing actual code, you don't necessarily have time to talk more about the more complex aspects of the algorithm, or not to get into those in as much detail. So I think there's definitely value to those sort of questions, but I think for co-op positions, it's going to be very uncommon to run into those, unless it's like an extension problem, or maybe is kind of the setup to writing the actual code. And I would argue, like, unless you're told to write pseudocode, or there's like, it's not usually worth asking, can I write pseudocode instead of real code? Because they're almost certainly going to tell you no, unless you're saying, oh, I just want to illustrate something or other. But in general, you're going to have to write actual code for most of your interviews, especially if it's just one interview for a co-op position. Does that answer your question? Excellent. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Do you have any tips on how to do system design or scalability?
So the question was, do I have any tips on how to do system design or scalability? That is tough. It's tough for me to answer mainly because I think I've been given very few of those questions myself, and I've interviewed such questions very few times myself. I think, honestly, the best I know how to say in that kind of category, like, honestly, probably check, like, there might be some Google interviewing stuff that has more to say on it than I can give you. I don't honestly feel like I can give you a great answer to that question. So I would suggest, the Google resources on interviewing, I would expect have something to offer on those topics. And kind of books like Cracking the Coding Interview probably also have something to offer. I think, like all things, the ideal scenario is you're able to practice for those sort of questions, but those are, they're almost domain knowledge in the sense that they're kind of less, it's harder to find practice problems for them. And that's part of why I don't have a lot to say, because I don't know if I've ever practiced those sort of questions myself either. Yeah, sorry, I don't have a better answer to that question. Well, here's another question. Where can I find a link to that GitHub studying page? Great question. Let's see here. So, yeah, for anyone who maybe didn't get it earlier, I think this is... Okay. So I think the link you're referring to is this gitlab.com/ndeakin/study. So this is it should be a public repository on GitLab. And this is the main thing in there is this list of data structures and algorithms. It's really just like a big old text file that's like super poorly formatted. I'm sorry for anyone who goes to look at it. But it's maybe better than nothing. It gives you at least an idea of kind of the scope I personally try to study for interviews, and also realize, as I mentioned before, in case you didn't see this for who asked the question, this is more than I would ever actually know for an actual interview, and definitely probably way more than you will be expected to know for like co-op positions, because this is a list I came up with when studying for full-time positions. So that's it. If you are able to know all of it, that is awesome. We don't need that. So I hope that answers your question, Kevin. And if you aren't aware, there's a bit of a delay. So if I might not hear what you're going to say, or you won't hear what I'm going to say until a little bit later, which I probably should have started with, but oh well. Yes. I don't have. Let me talk with the DSC people to see if there's like a way you could get access to it, because I'm not going to try and make you write down this Google Drives link. I think it could probably be possible to make that happen, but I'm going to defer to DSC people to help me help you with that. I think we don't have a lot more time, because I think Rishab was going to get up to say a couple more things before the very end, but we've got maybe 5 or 10 more minutes left. Are there any final questions? Yes.
How much does the interviewer care about like writing beautiful code, like talking about,
Yeah. So the question was, how much does an interviewer care about writing, elegant, nice code, like, no nested if statements, these sort of things. I think my perspective on that is, it's kind of a fine line to walk. I think it's similar to kind of using good variable names. It's like, yeah, try to use good variable names, but no, you're not going to have the time to think about it that you might if you're sitting at your desk, like at a full-time job where like you're going to be the poor sap on the other side reading this in 5 years, trying to figure out what the heck you were thinking. And we're all kind of aware of that. I hope, or I think at least. So to answer your question, I would say it's like generally the most important part is not the elegance of the code, it's how it works, but kind of do your best with what you can in the time constraints to also make it nice. Because like, sure, if you wrote the perfect solution to the algorithm and I can generally follow it and understand what it means, that's great. On the other side, like if you write like some like JavaScript like minimum byte count sort of solution where I look at it and I have no idea what it means, like I'm going to be unhappy. And on the opposite end, if you manage to write like the most beautiful version of it possible that's efficient, obviously that's better than otherwise, but it's not really the expectation given the environment of a 1 hour time limit or whatever the limit would be. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, those are great questions. So I'm going to mention both and then answer them. So the first one was, do interviewers ever check your code on a computer and, to see if it would compile or run, etc. And the second one was, should you add comments to your code on the whiteboard while you're programming on the whiteboard? So for the first question, do interviewers test your code? In my experience, I've never done that personally. That said, different places do things differently. I have had an interview where like I was actually given a computer with a failing test and I was told to like fix the test. I was told to fix the code that was causing the test to fail. So I think there are scenarios where you'll probably be, excruciatingly aware that it is going to run and you need to make it run. But in those scenarios, you also have the compiler to test against probably. Hopefully you're never going to be put in a situation where like you're just writing on paper and then they're going to say, okay, let's see if this compiles, because I think that wouldn't be very nice or fun for anyone. So hopefully that sort of situation doesn't occur. Does it answer your first question? And yeah, to be clear, I'm not sure that other people or companies don't do this, but I don't. And I think it's unlikely because that sounds like a big waste of time given the situation to me. So to answer the second question, should you add comments to the whiteboard? I've personally never done this, and I don't think I've ever seen an interview candidate do it. Generally because like my view on this is your comments to the code are going to be what you tell the interviewer. That's kind of my way of looking at it is, I give the comments as I write it to the interviewer. And maybe again, as we read through the solution together at the end. I don't feel it's necessary personally to like comment my code on the whiteboard. Like you don't have time for that. That's the main reason I wouldn't do it. Like I need to write extra lines of code to make sure I'm getting everything done quickly. I'm not going to waste time writing on a whiteboard things that I could just tell you. So that's my personal view on that is I wouldn't do that. Yes. Sorry, could you repeat that? Oh, sure. Yeah, the question was, could I talk more about my work at Google? So I think I mentioned I work on Stadia. I work on graphics tools. So this is kind of stuff like, making sure that, if you're a developer working on, really any platform, or if you're making a game for any platform, you need tools to figure out what's gone wrong when your game doesn't work properly or when it doesn't work as you expect. So we need to make sure that, Stadia also provides that. And so I think a really great example of like the sort of stuff my team does is there's an open source tool called RenderDoc. It's kind of an industry loved tool for debugging graphics frames using various graphics APIs. So my team are the sort of people that added support for Stadia to RenderDoc. So that, we can give developers a tool they're familiar with and they can use it and hopefully, be happy. And I guess I might also add, in particular, I work with the Vulkan Graphics API because Stadia uses the Vulkan Graphics API. So yeah, that's what I've been doing for a little over a year and a half I've been at Google, and it's been a lot of fun. Got time for a couple more questions? Yes. Yeah, so the question was, are there any characteristics that Google looks for in a resume or a candidate? So to be honest, I don't know almost anything about how people are selected for interviews at Google. I really don't know what they look for in resumes. So I can't answer that question. Maybe there's information online, but I'm not sure. Yeah, as far as like the resume part, I don't really know. And I think I touched on my thoughts on kind of what Google looks for in their interviews out of the interview itself, which, is largely problem-solving skills and communication, I think are the biggest things. If there's no other questions in the audience, I think Rishabh might have a couple closing words. And yeah, I guess before I give it over to Rishabh, thank you very much for your time. I hope you found this kind of useful at the very least.
Thank you, Nick. All right, so hello, everyone. Can I just stop presenting? All right, so I'm just going to steal a couple of minutes to discuss about something which I really want you guys to know about. 1 second while I try to grab my screen up there. So just a quick show of hands. How many of you are first-year students? Oh, wow. All right. Second year? Quite a few. Third year? Fourth year? Okay, perfect. How many of you go to Waterloo? Oh, wow. That's quite a lot. Laurier? And any other university? No? Okay, sounds good. All right, so yeah, I'm just going to take this moment now to talk about the solutions challenge. So, all right, so it's right there. So as you all probably know, the Developer Student Clubs is a club, and personally, I feel that it's more of a community. And there's an open challenge right now, which is pretty interesting. Oh, sorry. So there's a pretty interesting challenge which is out there in the open, and now it's good. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. So there's a public challenge out there where you're supposed to find a problem which is being faced by the society and bring up a technological solution for it. And the reason why should you be interested in this, and why should you actually apply for this and build projects for this specific challenge / online annual global competition? First, well, you're going to learn a lot of things in terms of making apps, making websites, making tools, services, anything. And not only that, but you're also going to be collaborating with other students. You could collaborate with Waterloo students, you could collaborate with Laurier students, and the teams are of size up to 4 people. So the good thing is this year, there are going to be up to 10 winners, and the prizes are pretty cool. And I'll show you guys the link right after this. So I'm just going to scroll through all of this whole thing like really quickly. So first, you're going to obviously register yourselves. Then you're going to think of a solution which you want to target, a problem which you want to target, and build a solution for. Once you do that, you submit. And if you guys win, well, the prizes are pretty cool. The prizes are pretty cool. One of them is you get featured on the Google Developer channels. Second, I guess you get Google flies you over to Mountain View, I guess. I'm not 100% sure about that, but it's all on the website. And I would 100% recommend you guys to go over this. This is extremely cool. And over here, this is the URL if you want to take a picture of. I guess I'll post this over the Facebook event as well. So the other thing which I want to mention is this is one of our many upcoming events. This is one of the few events which we're going to be hosting over the whole term. So the upcoming events would also include study jams, where we're going to be discussing about, how do you, let's say, use GCP, for example, as well as machine learning, some machine learning tools, how do you use libraries like TensorFlow, and all of them are going to be around 3 to 4 hour sessions, and those will be conducted on it's like Coursera. It's called Quick Labs, and you're going to be following through those steps. So if you guys are interested in this, like I would recommend you guys to go to the second link out there, bit.ly/DSCUW, and register yourselves right at the bottom of the screen. At the bottom of the page, you're gonna see like a sign up page. So you guys should 100% sign up over there. Also, yeah, that's pretty much it. I just wanted to discuss about this, and yeah, that's pretty much the end of this event. And thank you all for coming over here. Hope you guys learned a lot throughout this event. All right, thank you guys. Also, if you can keep the badges if you want. The exit is just that way itself.